Welcome back to the channel, guys. This is Scott K. You know, it's been a while, but Gateron finally did it. They finally named a new switch, something that actually makes sense, at least a little bit. The switch in question today is the Gateron North Pole linear switch. At first look, you're probably thinking, these look like little ice cubes. Well, I guess that's the point. If they named it North Pole, I assume because North Pole is cold and has a lot of ice. But who knows, Gateron and their kooky marketing team. Besides the whole ice cube theme that's going on here, the elephant in the room is this. Everglide already has these out. They've been out for a while, and they're called Aquakings. Full polycarbonate housing, clear looks, smooth, and deep sound. So, can Gateron beat Aquakings at their own game? That is what we're gonna find out today. Let's get started. Well, actually, before we do that, I just wanted to mention I have no affiliations with Gateron whatsoever. They don't send me anything, they don't pay me anything. I just grew fond of their new linear switches. That's why I've been testing a lot more of those versus some of the other ones. In case you're curious, let's get started. So, it's been a hot minute since Gateron dropped their latest linear switches on the market. They named it North Pole after a region on Earth that is pretty cold. And these new switches do look pretty cool. Completely clear PC housing. Not just clear, but also very glossy. They actually make the Aquakings look dull by comparison. These are a linear switch with a full 4mm travel, and given that their target was probably the Aquaking, should also provide a smooth operation and deep sound profile as well. This we're going to find out today. Let's take these apart and do some analysis of what they're made of, the specifications, as well as if they share any parts with any other Gateron switch. So first up is the housing. Both the top and bottom housing is made of clear polycarbonate. The stem is also clear, but this is actually not made of PC. Rather, it's a clear version of the ink housing material, so it should be pretty smooth, right? The spring is a gold-plated standard length 60 gram bottom-out spring. Looking into these, I found a few interesting notes. While the stem on this is ink material, it's actually not the ink stem. If you do a quick comparison, the North Pole stem actually shares more similarities with the blunt stem of the Oil King switch. The length of the three are similar since they're all 4mm travel, but I feel that that's the only commonality between these three here. Since I know that the Oil King and the new Gateron Pro series share a similar stem mold, I decided to compare the North Pole stem to that of the Oil King as well as the new Yellow Pro 2.0. I really thought they would actually be the same, but lo and behold, nope. While the Oil King and the Yellow 2.0 has stem cuts in the north and east positions, the North Pole has it in the north and west. So this showed me that the stem mold for the North Pole is actually new. Looking at the bottom housings of the new Gateron linears, I can see that the ink and the Oil King, even the CJ for that matter, has fully blocked lower housings. On the other hand, the Gateron Pro Yellow 2.0 and the North Poles have open lower housings for the LED. But the North Pole is a 5-pin switch while the Pro 2.0 is a 3-pin, so once again, different mold for the North Pole again. Another unique aspect of the North Pole is that it has these light poles in the upper housing for that sweet RGB, that gamery RGB, right? This is something that is shared with the Gateron Yellow Pro 2.0. I'm pretty sure that these upper housings are actually shared between those two, so at least I could win one, right? Now, what about against the Aquakings? Overall, while they share similarities, you can tell right off the bat that the North Poles are very glossy while the Aquakings are not. One thing I did also notice is that the North Poles have an odd heft to it that the Aquakings actually didn't, so I measured it. Strangely enough, the North Poles are heavier switches by a tiny bit, and this actually holds true even against the other Gateron linears as well. Perhaps the material and that extra light pole is doing this? As usual with my switch test, I'll be comparing the North Pole against a few different switches to give you a reference of how they fare. Today, we'll be looking at the main competitor, the Aquakings, along with the recent Oil Kings, the Ink Black V2 new molds, the Gateron Yellow Pro 2.0, and the Wuque Onion. The Onion is also a great switch, so I wanted to kind of throw that in as a comparison. Also, as usual, I'll be using my trusty alu-plate Portico as the testbed. Once installed, you can see how glossy these switches really are. And finally, I'll be using the ePBT pink on blacks as the keycaps as I normally do as well. This way, you can always go back and compare to my previous tests. Here's a quick typing test of the stock North Poles to begin. So if you recall, one of the great things about the Oil King switches is that they can be used stock. What about the North Poles? Well, they could also be used stock as well, but I would actually lube them for the best impact. I ended up lubing it with Krytox 205 and also managed to shove in a really thin 0.125mm TX film into it, which wasn't absolutely necessary, but you know, FOMO, right? I will show you a full typing test with the lubed and filmed North Pole switches in the end as well. Now then, let's go into the measurements, shall we? First up is the stem wobble test. And as usual, I will use a digital caliper to measure the deflections and provide you the objective measurements. So, looking at the chart, you can see that the new stem and the molds work out well for the North Pole here. Not quite Duroc Palm level of wobble performance, but definitely beats out everything else we're looking at today. Even the latest Ink Black V2s with the mold update, you know, they should have just called it V3 honestly. Even that one. After that, pretty much all the other switches share similar levels of wobble performance, which is to say that they're all pretty good. 0.5mm of max diagonal deflection is actually excellent. Finally, the Gateron Yellow KS9 2.0 trails the pack here with a commendable 0.57mm max diagonal deflection. I feel this may be intentional since they are like less than half the price, so Gateron pretty much had to do this to create a gap. Now, let's move on to the sound tests. I'll go one by one with single presses, then switch over to double pressing to help simulate typing better. In addition to the sound recording, I'll also use a spectrum analyzer to see what kind of frequencies these switches are throwing out. So, let's check it out. I hope that helps you get a feel. In my opinion, I felt like the Gat Yellows were the clear clack winner here, and the Aquaking does sound the deepest out of them all, by a small margin at least. So what does the frequency measurements show us? So when I look at this, the first thing that popped into my mind was, with the exception of the Gateron Yellow KS9 Pro 2.0, wow, a mouthful. Kudos to you Gateron once again for the naming, but yes, with the exception of this switch, everything else kind of falls in a similar sound range. While the switches do throw out a bunch of different frequencies, I try to focus on the low housing collision sounds, since I felt like this is what people want to know, right? So I created a dominant range for the lows that you can see as reference. This is where the spectrum analyzer show the darkest spots for the highest concentration of these sounds. Overall, most of these switches are fairly deep sounding switches, with the Aquaking showing the deepest and tightest low range, followed by the North Poles. Based on this, as well as my subjective opinion, I will put together the sound ranking for you in the next chart as well. So, backed by popular demand, here is the Keyboard switch performance comparison chart. I hope that this helps to put things into a visual chart to help you decide on the switch you're looking for. So as usual, we'll be looking at 5 different criteria for the switch performance. It'll be stem wobble, switch smoothness, switch sound level, sound pitch or frequency, and finally, the cost. So first up is the switch stem wobble. As shown before in the stem deflection measurements, the winner of this group is the North Pole by a small margin. It had a total diagonal deflection value of 0.42mm and places it in the lead. Then comes the Ink Black V2s with the 0.45mm and pretty much everything else right after that with 0.5mm of deflection. The only one trailing behind a bit more is the Gateron Yellow KS9 Pro 2.0. But honestly, none of these switches are wobbly switches, so we're pretty much splitting hairs here. Next is the smoothness of the switch. These are all fairly smooth switches overall. However, you can really see how far Gateron is pushing the smoothness aspect by looking at the new polished stem switches. Out of these, the Aquakings lead the pack with the smoothest operation, while the biggest surprise of the test here was actually the Gateron Yellow KS9 Pro 2.0 coming close second. I know that smoothness is something they wanted to improve with the 2.0 update, and they definitely achieved that. Wow, from a budget switch nonetheless. Not far behind is the new North Pole switch, also very smooth with what seems like a polished stem. It's crazy to think now that one of the smoothest switches of the old days, the Ink Black, can't even make it to the top 3 on this chart. But after the Ink Black V2s are the Aquakings, which is also a smooth switch, but you can feel slight scratch when you actually press the switch in angles. And finally, the Wuque Onion trails the pack as last. But once again, none of these switches are scratchy. They are all pretty smooth, just some are very exceptional. Alright, moving on to sound. First sound criteria is the sound level. This is whether the switch is loud or quiet. Out of this group, I would say that the Gateron Yellow KS9 Pro 2.0 top out the chart with a fairly loud sound, followed closely by the Wuque Onions. Next up is the Aquakings, which features a pretty prominent sound even when they're on the deeper sound. Then you have the more subtle switches like the Ink Blacks, the North Poles, and finally the Aquaking, which tends to be a quieter switch in general as well. Next sound criteria is the pitch. So this is a combination of the objective spectrum analysis as well as my opinion. First off, none of these switches are actually high pitched, maybe with the exception of the Gateron Yellow KS9 Pro 2.0s. However, since this is relative to each other, there will be switches that are higher and ones that are lower. As mentioned, the KS9 Pro 2.0 are the highest pitch out of this group by far. Then the rest all kind of fall in line, all about a half a step deeper than the last. So it goes Aquakings, and then the Ink Blacks, then the Wuque Onions, the North Poles, and finally the Aquakings. So in the end, I feel that the Aquaking still holds the crown for being one of the deepest switches. It just slightly beat out the North Pole in this area. And now, final and the most objective criteria here is the price. Most of these switches were in a similar price range with the exception of the KS9 Yellow. At the time of the review, the most expensive switch of this group is the Ink Black V2s at 75 cents a piece. The Wuque Onion followed it at 70 cents a piece. Then the North Pole and the Aquakings are tied at 67 cents a piece, and the Aquakings at 65 cents a piece, so they're all pretty close to each other. Obviously, the value king here is the Gateron Yellow KS9 Pro 2.0. Honestly, can you believe that a switch that costs a third of the others is actually one of the smoothest switches in this comparison? That's pretty mind-boggling. So, I hope that the slew of tests and this chart helps to put things into perspective in terms of various performance metrics and helps you make the best decision in terms of what you're looking for in a switch. Alright, before I jump into my final thoughts, let's take a look at the full typing test here with the lubed and filmed North Pole switches. Alright, I hope you can see why I said the North Pole should be lubed. Don't really have to film it, but definitely lube it for max results. You can use them stock if you want more clack, but if you want depth, a little Krytox 205 goes a long way. Now, with all this shown and all that has been said, did the North Poles beat out the Aquakings? In my opinion, yes. Out of all the testing and reviewing, the only one area the Aquaking slightly beats out the North Poles is in the absolute depth of sound. However, when you consider that the North Pole is a tighter switch, it's a smoother switch, and has a more prominent sound, it might be a good thing that there are alternatives to the Aquakings. Over the course of time, Aquakings have been a switch I just wanted to love, but I always ran into such inconsistencies in like lubing, in feel, and sound that I don't use them very much. Now, if I have a need for a deep PC switch with a clear housing, I know now what I will be grabbing. Oh, like the Aquakings, these also work north facing with cherry profile GMK keycaps as well, which is another plus. I hope this video was helpful in putting things into a more objective and visual perspective. And as usual, if you enjoy the video or its content, please like and subscribe and I'll have more content for you in the future. Thank you.